We're exploring the psychological journey someone takes when they leave a high-demand religious group. Specifically, we're looking at the Jehovah's Witnesses and focusing on the unique difficulties for people actually raised in the religion. Our goal here isn't just numbers, it's about getting into the deep personal stories behind, such a huge life change. And for this deep dive, we're working with a really significant research paper. It came out in August 2023 by Nick Katiam. This isn't about stats so much as it is interpretive phenomenological analysis. Fancy words, but basically it means looking closely at the lived experiences of four people. It's about their journeys, not just data.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area because, often you hear about religious affiliation being, well, good for you, beneficial. But leaving, especially from these high-demand, high-cost groups like the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's linked in the research to, and this is their term, deleterious mental health effects. Oh, which is quite a strong way to put it, but it reflects a really heavy reality. And what's really striking, I think, is that even with these known costs, leaving seems to be happening more. The numbers are pretty stark, actually. Something like 66% of people raised as Jehovah's Witnesses end up leaving.
66%.
Yeah.
Wow. So, okay, what does it really mean then to leave a community that's basically shaped your whole life? And what does that do to someone psychologically? That kind of massive shift. Let's try and unpack that.
Right. And to really get the leaving part, you first have to understand what it's like inside. The research describes Jehovah's Witnesses as fundamentalist, high control, and high cost. They tell members very clearly to be no part of this world. That means seriously limiting contact with anyone outside the group, anyone in the world. So this creates what the paper calls a total person environment. Basically, all your values, your beliefs, how you act, it all comes from inside the group. Very little outside influence or different ways of doing things. And the demands are high, lots of meetings, lots of preaching, and they keep a close eye on people. No free riders, as they say.
That sounds intense, really all-encompassing. So what is it about that total person environment that makes getting out so disorienting?
Well, I think the key thing is that leaving isn't just walking away from a club. It's more like your whole identity collapses. Because as the research really highlights, the group was their identity for many of these people. It leaves this huge existential hole, much bigger than just losing friends. There's a quote in the paper that really captures it. It describes leaving as moving from a safe world infused with meaning and set standards of conduct to a discomforting world of moral relativism, ambiguity, and risk. Just try to imagine that for a second. Your whole world, everyone you know, your purpose, all tied to one belief system, and then, poof, it unravels.
And that unraveling, it seems, is traumatic. The paper found this common thread, right? All participants reported trauma linked to an existential crisis after they left. It wasn't just like a bad breakup. It was shaking the very foundations of who they were. The individual stories must be incredibly powerful. Was there anything in their specific experiences that really stood out to the researchers?
I think the sheer universality of the distress was striking. It didn't seem to matter much if they were really central figures or more on the edges. The pain was profound. Take Karen. She was described as a pillar of the congregation, an elder's daughter even. But before leaving, she felt incredibly miserable, like she was on a hamster wheel of doubt, trying harder and harder, until she realized the distress wasn't her fault. She called that time very stressful and very upsetting and even really frightening.
Wow. And then there was Jane. Her story sounded a bit different.
Yes, Jane's experience was unique because she didn't really have doubts before she was disfellowshipped, which is the formal expulsion. But the act of being disfellowshipped itself, she described it as very, very traumatizing, probably the darkest place I have been in my life. And even though she felt she was kind of on the periphery, it led to depressive days. And she admitted feeling very suicidal.
That's heavy. And Dennis, his story involved a specific doctrine, didn't it?
Right. For Dennis, it was the group's stance on blood transfusions. That was the breaking point, the thing that sparked his doubt. It led him to resign from his responsibilities in the congregation. And sadly, it caused a huge battle in the marriage that went on for 10 years and ended his first marriage. He just sums it up as a bad period. Understated, probably.
Yeah, sounds like it. And Joe, he seemed to come at it from a more intellectual angle.
Exactly. Joe had what he calls scientific set of reasons for leaving. But it still led to this escalating existential crisis. He described realizing it's all just fake, it's all just a big lie, and then the deeper realization that you no longer believe that there is even a God, that there's no purpose to any of this, that nothing really matters, which he said becomes very nihilistic. That's a terrifying place to be mentally.
Absolutely. Going from total certainty to Nothing.
Right. And he admitted he started drinking heavily because of the stress and anxiety.
So these stories, they're all different, but the outcome seems similar in terms of the psychological cost.
That's exactly what the research emphasizes. It pulls back from the individual stories to show that common thread. It didn't matter what their status was or how they left, whether they were pushed out or walked away.
Right.
All of them went through profound negative psychological experiences. We're talking misery, stress, distress, fear, hopelessness, depression, even suicidal thoughts. It really shows the heavy toll leaving takes.
And one really specific, painful part of that is the practice of shunning, right?
Yes, shunning, that's a core finding. It's where current members are basically ordered to cut off all social contact with people who leave. It doesn't matter how you leave, even if you just sort of drift away, fade as they call it. The research consistently points to the devastating psychological impact. It's described as a social death. Some researchers, like Lawlish and McLaren, even say being formally disfellowshipped is tantamount to being dead in that social world.
And the participant stories, they really make that concrete. Jane's experience sounds heartbreaking. She said her best friends of 10 years just shunned me overnight after she was disfellowshipped. Total cutoff. And even her own grandmother, who raised her, told her she was serving Satan and would die in Armageddon, then shunned her.
Yeah.
Jane used the phrase hardcore shunned, felt completely betrayed, and that loneliness contributed to suicidal thoughts.
It's incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
Karen echoed that feeling of betrayal. She felt expendable. You know, people who claim to love you suddenly immediately reject you.
And the impact can ripple through generations. Dennis's story.
Right, the intergenerational impact. He has 3 kids, 2 of whom have 0 contact with him. He's never met his 4 grandchildren, doesn't even know if his youngest son has kids. And he asks, rhetorically, so what sort of a wrecked family is that?
Yeah.
It's devastating.
And Joe, similar story with family.
Yeah. He said, I haven't talked to my mother in years, and my sister doesn't really talk to me.
Mhm.
And he reflected on the whole lifestyle, calling it horrible because of the fear, obligation, and guilt.
Mhm.
Specifically, calling out the practice of cutting off people that you love simply because they don't share the same religious beliefs as you.
So the rules are really strict then about contact.
Incredibly strict. The paper notes that contact is generally only allowed for, like, essential family business. Important family business is the phrase used. But even that is often difficult or avoided. Jane's comment really hits hard. You literally can't even text or call them if you're dying.
Wow.
It just highlights this impossible situation. How do you cope when your entire support system just evaporates?
And hovering over all this is what the research calls the fear of apostasy, right? This deep-seated guilt about thinking differently.
Exactly. It's this intense guilt and shame associated with having independent thoughts, especially ones that oppose the doctrine. It acts as a huge barrier to leaving in the first place, and it can linger, causing distress long after someone is actually out.
Okay, so it sounds incredibly bleak. The trauma, the shunning, the identity crisis. But the research didn't just stop there, did it? There was also hope.
Absolutely. Despite all these immense challenges, this huge cost, the research found something really powerful. The participants overwhelmingly expressed a profound sense of freedom. And importantly, no regret about leaving. Instead of being stuck, they were actively, building new lives, constructing new, meaningful identities for themselves.
That's amazing. And how did they do that? What helped them rebuild?
A really key element that came up repeatedly was research in developing critical thinking. Joe, for instance, talked about educating himself, reading Eastern philosophy, psychology, applying critical thinking to his old beliefs, and realizing they just weren't based on fact, logic, and reason.
And Jane's path to research was interesting, too. She was scared of it at first.
Yeah, she was terrified of apostate literature. That's what the witnesses call any critical material. But ironically, she said a psychedelic experience helped her break through that fear and see the group as a cult. After that, doing the research became imperative for her. She needed it to shed the guilt and feel like she could live a normal life.
And Karen found community online.
Yes. She mentioned finding the ex-JWs subreddit, reading stories from other people who had left. She said that was crucial for her to believe she could survive it, especially after being told her whole life that leaving meant disaster.
That connection, even online, must be a lifeline.
Definitely. And as people rebuilt, the study noticed 2 main types of identities emerging. First, what they called apostate identities. This was seen more in Dennis and Joe. It's characterized by this ongoing engagement with and refutation of the Jehovah's Witness doctrines, Dennis developed this sort of playful apostate persona. He'd insist people call him Mr. or Dennis, not brother. He actually enjoyed arguing with preachers online. And Joe was very focused on critiquing doctrinal flip-flops and what he saw as hypocrisy. He viewed the organization primarily as a publishing company that bolsters the egos of a small group of men. He even mentioned Bottlegate, this incident involving expensive liquor seen with the governing body, as an example of that perceived hypocrisy.
Okay, so that's one type. What was the other?
The second type was termed empathetic identities. This was more Jane and Karen. Their focus wasn't so much on fighting the doctrine, but on the perceived lack of empathy within the organization and a real desire to help others going through similar things. Jane, for instance, spoke about serious allegations of childhood abuse being ignored by the elders. And she now plans to write an autobiography, hoping it can be a resource for those who are questioning things. She wants mental health professionals to understand this better too. Karen talked about a healing experience she had doing a counseling course, and now she wants to help people with similar situations.
So different paths to rebuilding, but both moving forward. Though it wasn't all smooth sailing, right? There were still challenges.
Oh, for sure. The study notes ongoing difficulties. Jane still dealt with social anxiety. And for Karen, her husband remaining a witness made it hard for her to build new friendships freely.
Right.
But underlying it all was this strong desire to build a new life, to move forward.
And that desire leads to a really important point from the research, doesn't it, about support?
Yes, a critical practical takeaway. All the participants stressed the need for better mental health support. They need therapists and counselors who actually understand the dynamics of high-control groups. It's not just standard therapy sometimes. This idea of religious trauma syndrome, RTS, is gaining traction. It recognizes that the trauma isn't always about single big events, but sometimes it's this pervasive damage from an environment that controls everything: thoughts, feelings, relationships, especially if you grew up in it.
Mm-hmm.
That makes recovery really complex and easily misunderstood if the therapist isn't aware.
So RTS is a specific kind of trauma.
Right. It's seen as complex trauma, particularly damaging when it starts in childhood. The research points to features in these groups that signal a high risk of harm. Things like spiritual abuse, the cynical manipulation of uncertainty, making people doubt themselves constantly. Also, exaggeration of out-group aggression, making the outside world seem terrifying, and the severe ostracism, the shunning, which, tragically, the paper notes, can even lead to outcomes like familicide and suicide in extreme cases.
So listening to all this, what should you, our listener, take away? I mean, it really highlights the need for critical thinking about our own beliefs, doesn't it? And the importance of seeking support, real support, when going through huge life changes. And just understanding the deep impact these things can have on who we are. What really strikes you from all this?
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, you just have to acknowledge the incredible resilience here. These individuals went through so much, faced such loss, yet found a way to rebuild. It really is a testament to the human spirit, the drive for meaning and freedom.
It absolutely is. And this research, while focused on one group, really deepens our understanding of bigger themes, trauma, identity, how groups shape us. And it poses a really important question, I think. If groups have this much power to shape our reality, what responsibility do we have to maybe critically examine our own beliefs and where they come from, and maybe to extend a bit more empathy to people whose paths, whose truths look really different from our own? That's a powerful point. It makes you think, doesn't it? How easily we accept the narratives we're given, how much sheer courage it must take to question everything you've ever known, to forge your own path. So maybe a final thought for you to consider. What sources of truth are you consuming? And what kind of world are they asking you to believe in, or maybe even asking you to leave behind?